hopefully that's working for everybody. Hi, Trip.
Hello, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Okay, well, let's just launch right in. Thanks everyone for joining us for our conversation here today about everything that went down during the legislative session. And it might be good to reflect on why we do these or why we're doing this. But first, let's just let people know that if anyone has any questions or they have comments, we would love to hear them. You'll need to type them into the Q&A, and we'll be monitoring that throughout the our chat today. So please do weigh in. And we'll get started. I'm Marjorie Childress. I'm the managing editor here at New Mexico in Depth. Bella, why don't you introduce yourself?
I'm Bella Davis. I'm the Indigenous Affairs reporter at New Mexico in Depth. I've been here for about a year and a half.
Hi, I'm Trip Jennings and the executive director of New Mexico in Depth. Hello, everyone.
Excellent. So why don't we just launch right in? But I think it might be useful. I mean, Trip to and Bella both to talk a little bit about when we say, we're talking about the legislative session, what we're really talking about is really impactful public policy that either passed or didn't pass during a moment when all of our citizen lawmakers come together. So it's important to pay attention to that and to actually, process what happened. And none of these bills, I mean, a few of them so far have been signed by the governor, but we should also note that all of these bills that passed that we'll talk about, most of them are still subject to the governor's veto pen. She has 20 days past the end of the session to actually sign the bills, veto them, or just let them die.
Yeah, and it's important to note that with the state budget, the $10.2 billion state budget, and then you got the the $1 billion capital outlay package, those are subject to her line item veto authority. Mm-hmm. So she can go in there and just strike lines. And that's what I think I'm going to be really interested in the next couple of weeks to see what fares well and what does not.
And she undoubtedly will veto some provisions in each of those bills. I can't recall a year in which a governor did not line item veto those bills.
Yeah. And some of it will be there will be amounts struck in the budget, amounts of dollars, but there will be language like the administration, we'll see. I think this is probably in the budgets, in every budget I've ever looked at. The administration will report to the Legislative Finance Committee on this such and such. And governors typically strike that language too, that's like legislative oversight of the executive branch. Mm-hmm. So that's just a small inside baseball kind of thing that one looks forward to as well. We don't report on it, but that is always the give and take, the checks and balances between the executive branch and the legislative branch.
So these budgets, the state budget that passed and the capital outlay budget, which is the money that gets spent on mainly like infrastructure. It's like kind of the money that gets spent on, buildings, roads, all sorts of things of that nature, is quite large. They're both, I don't recall ever seeing a capital outlay budget as large as the one that got passed this year, which was around 1.4 billion. And almost like 2/3 of that, or a little bit more, it comes out of the general fund. It's not actually being bonded out. In years past, it was bonded out.
900 million. Yeah.
Yeah. This is just a huge amount of money going out into, communities across the state to spend on infrastructure. A lot of it is also transportation. Major roads projects got passed, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of road projects. So anyone who actually drives a lot in New Mexico is probably going, yay.
Well, I mean, yes, but it also means construction. So yes, long term, yay. But you know, I, as someone who lives near a lot of construction projects, yeah, it's great at the end, but sometimes it does cause a little bit of headache. But yes, you're right. You're right. I'm just being real.
Yeah, I also just, you know, and I reflecting on that capital outlay budget, which I'm just kind of, it got passed, you know, towards the end of the session, which it is always the case, and there's so much in it. It's not a super transparent process, the putting together of that bill. I mean, this year, um, you know, folks were lauding the House Budget Committee for being very, very transparent in how they put the state budget together. You know, they got a lot of props for that. The capital outlay budget, it just kind of drops in the last leg of the session. And, you know, and then you have this massive list of projects. And I'm just now beginning to kind of dig into it and read through it and see everything that passed. But I do remember on the House floor, I mean, Senate floor, when it was being debated, George Munoz, Senator George Munoz, who heads up the Senate Finance Committee, he told folks, he said that this was the last year. And I mean, I think this was like a threat. It would be a big thing, but he said he's no longer going to be on board with passing another bill, which they also do every year, which extends the deadline on a lot of these capital projects because the money's not being spent down. I mean, the state has billions of dollars worth of capital projects from years past, and it still has not spent that money. So that money's just kind of sitting.
5 billion.
Yeah. So when I see
Yeah.
something like this bill pass with all of this huge number, I kind of think about that and I wonder about it. You know, they still pushed out a ton of money to capital projects.
You know, I was trying to think back if I've ever seen a capital outlay bill this large, and I think I've seen some that have neared or been around $1 billion when it was really like, you know, revenues were high, but 1.4 billion is, I think, I can't say it's historic because I just don't know, but I think it's got to be in, you know, in the top 10 list of capital outlay bills coming from the legislature. And they had $4.7 billion worth of requests. So they you know, they narrowed it down by, what is that, 3.3 billion. So it's 1.4 billion.
So
Yeah.
we have a couple of comments and questions. Mari asks, she says, curious to know if NMID has capacity to lobby MLG in line items. So we do not lobby, but you can. And
You call the governor's office.
yeah, I expect there is a ton of lobbying going on right now. Also, another thing that we don't see, our transparency laws in New Mexico don't require that level of disclosure. But I imagine there is significant lobbying happening right now to try to not get certain things vetoed by the governor. Dee Dee Feldman, hi Dee Dee, says HB2 will be the last to be signed with line item vetoes. Absolutely. And she says, imagine analyzing those bills and deciding what to cut. Yeah, her staff is probably working overtime right now.
I think that the budget bill, just the budget bill, typically averages around 280, 290 pages every session. And yeah, that's a lot of work. That's just one bill. The capital outlay is a tremendous amount of work as well. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have someone who says that the new name for the junior bill, the junior money, which we've covered in the past, Marjorie, is now the Government Results and Opportunity Fund. So
Well,
that's also another, you know.
I mean, arguably half of the capital outlay bill, it could be covered under that acronym because I think more than half of it, I was looking at the breakdown in the fiscal impact analysis, more than half, slightly more than half of the capital outlay bill was allocated by either the governor or individual lawmakers. So that's a lot of money that individual lawmakers and the governor have the power to just come up with their own list and push out the door to specific projects. And we are the only state in the nation that continues to do it that way. And it's been a big controversy in the past. It's kind of, that conversation's quietened down a little bit of late. Some people call that a kind of a pejorative in a way. They call it the Christmas tree bill, like the bill itself has all these ornaments in it, on it. Those are all the $50,000 to this project, $75,000 to this project, versus what many people think of as a more rational approach of having state agencies just develop the big capital outlay budget and push the money out the door.
Should we maybe just for a second take a step back for those people who don't understand maybe reauthorization bills for capital outlay and just explain what we were talking about with as far as $5 billion, which is there may be, and we've covered this over the years, but there are some projects that were, basically funded 5, 6, 7 years ago that still haven't been built because they haven't gotten full funding, or maybe, there's part of this is also prices will go up year over year. So therefore, maybe there's not enough money to cover a project. So the $5 billion is hundreds of projects on the state that have not been completed. And this is something that has been around, this issue, unfunded projects, has been around since I've been in New Mexico when I came here in 2005. So this is not an unknown issue to lawmakers.
So Dee Dee says it's usually, in terms of who gets to divvy up that money, it's usually a third House, a third Senate, and a third governor's allocations. So yeah, and then Amari says, what is NMID most least happy about as a reporting organization?
I can I take a lead on this? I mean, and Marjorie, we may have the same issues. I will say that I'm still a little upset. This is year over year. This is not just this year, that I don't know more about how much money lobbyists spend on lawmakers. Or what, and again, lobbyists are necessary to the legislative process, but it's good to know how much they're spending on lawmakers. We don't know a lot of stuff around transparency. I wish we knew more about, we had stronger financial disclosure law for policymakers. Those are my two.
No, I definitely would ditto that. I mean, I think when you're up there, so as persons, like individuals, and journalists, we have probably perspectives on things, but as journalists, we really try to, once you really follow, I think, the legislative process, as long as we have, you start learning all of the just complexity of these debates. And so I don't know that there's a lot of, we could say that we're happy about or not happy about. We just try to be fair in all of our reporting. But I think disclosure and transparency is at the top of our list as journalists. And it's just, this session in particular was incredibly frustrating on this level because not only do we have poor disclosure laws around financial disclosure and campaign finance disclosure, and on what lobbyists have to report, the actual state portal where what we do get reported has had some major bugs in it around lobbyist disclosure, and it made it incredibly difficult to work with during the session. So, the lobbyist reports are due in January, and it was just very difficult to kind of track lobbyist money in any kind of structured, organized way. So there's just big things that we're not real happy about there. All that said, I mean, we will carry on. So Dee Dee says, what was the Munoz initiative to deal with unspent capital, or at least test the efficacy of its projects?
I don't know the answer to this question. I know that I talked to him briefly on I think Wednesday, the next to the last day, and I was asking him about what he said, because as Dee Dee Feldman knows, when someone like the Senate Finance Chairman says something about capital outlay and reauthorization, it spreads like wildfire around the Capitol. So, I got up that morning and people were talking about it. I don't know. I personally don't know. Maybe Marjorie, you do. I don't know what how he's going to that's a good question, how he's going to test which projects are worthy of keeping on. How does he move forward, like in basically deciding what the cutoff point is in funding these kind of projects? Marjorie, didn't they, when John Arthur Smith was Senate Finance Chairman, they kind of agreed, the Legislative Finance Committee is you couldn't give anything less than $50,000 to a project, as I recall, because at some point they were donating, lawmakers were giving $5,000, $10,000 to projects. They were taking steps a few years back on trying to rationalize the process. I don't know where we stand there. I don't know if you know.
I don't know. I mean, I don't know okay, to answer this question, yes, I'm with Tripp. We don't really know what George Munoz has in mind. I think he's the chair of the Senate Finance Committee. He has a lot of power over budget making, but he is just one person. And I have seen over the past decade, a lot of people just bang their heads against the capital outlay wall in terms of accountability, getting the projects done, getting the money out the door, getting the projects done. This issue of the capital outlay money that remains unspent is ongoing. It has long been the case that we've had a big pot of money there. And personally, I think that we're talking about wholesale reform of the capital outlay system in order to change that. And that would require a lot of people to be involved in that. So I'm not saying that he's just making a threat and it doesn't have any legs, but I in some ways I kind of took it as just a warning, just hey guys, we need to really, look at this and take this seriously. That's how I kind of took it. I mean, if I needed to take it a little bit more seriously, please let me know. So,
she
okay, go ahead.
Well, she also offers Dee Dee Feldman, for those of you who do not know, she was in the state Senate for, gosh, I think close to 20 years. Was it 18 years, 20 years? I can't remember exactly. She will, of course, answer the question in the chats, but she was in the Senate, and she says every year when HB2, that's the state budget, comes over to the Senate, this is while she was a senator, senators propose amendments. Some make it in, most do not. But I don't think there's any way to track who proposed what or who proposes what. That's an interesting. I remember some sessions where I would try to pay attention to that more closely than I did this session, and yeah, it was very hard to track.
I mean,
that is a transparency issue.
Yeah. I mean, and it gets to like senators or lawmakers. The legislative staff are not allowed to disclose any of that kind of information. So that kind of information would have to come from lawmakers themselves. And I've heard lawmakers over the years say, we need more transparency on these sorts of things. So Charles Goodmacher, hi Charles, he wants to know, why didn't any one bill opposed by NMOGA pass this session? That's the New Mexico Oil and Gas Association. So why didn't any one bill opposed by the New Mexico Oil and Gas Association pass this session? Great question, Charles. We actually did some reporting in 2019. Because that was Michelle Lujan Grisham's first year in office as governor. And when she came in, she had a big clean energy agenda, a big kind of environmental agenda. And there was a lot of discussion about how this Democratic majorities in the House and the Senate, now a new Democratic governor after 8 years of a Republican governor, did the oil and gas industry Or are they on the like ropes, you know, and in terms of regulation? And a reporter who was working, he continues to work with us periodically, Elizabeth Miller, she kind of followed that story during the session. And we wrote a story after the session concluded. And we said, basically, they had nothing to fear. So they had nothing to fear in 2019 because while we have these Democratic majorities who really strong, many of them very strongly like attuned to environmental measures, and they have definitely passed forward a clean energy agenda. I mean, this year we got a clean fuels bill passed. In terms of regulating the oil and gas industry, it's an uphill fight because so much of our state budget is supported by the oil and gas industry, and that is really the real issue there in a nutshell. Would you to add anything to that or?
Bella has not said anything. No, we'll make sure that you get a
You go
chance.
ahead. No, yeah.
Yeah, 40 to 45% of the state budget every year comes, from various sources from the oil and gas industry, and that makes it a very tough, a very tough battle for those who are in this fight. And I would say, I've said this before and I'll keep saying it, if you had an economically diversified state, i.e. you didn't have like just a few large industries or things like that, it might be easier to take on the oil and gas industry. But New Mexico does not have a really diversified economy here, in the sense that there's one very large industry, and that's the oil and gas industry. And as we're seeing with the global markets right now, that is producing the windfall. So I think it's a tough issue. I think that but it's also a long-term battle. And I think in the future, the conversation might well be very different. Well, I just don't know when that will shift, honestly.
So we probably it's already almost one, so let's keep moving into some other areas. But do we want to touch on what I think we ought to, that the governor has threatened a special session at her press conference last week at the conclusion of the session. She threatened a special session to come back and look at more crime initiatives. Now, whether or not that will actually happen, I mean, we'll see. Maybe, I don't know if she was for real on that. And, but most of the package of proposals that she had in her big crime agenda for the session did not pass, although arguably the big one, which was the 7-day waiting period to purchase a firearm, did pass. And her other big agenda, which was the strategic water supply, did not pass either. Which I think it kind of reminded me of the her hydrogen hub thing when she came with that. I mean, I just feel like sometimes when she comes with these big environmental proposals right before a session that she hasn't really built support for within the environmental community writ large. I think there's a real chance of failure there. So, and I think that's what we saw in this case as well.
Yeah, I think that's correct. I mean, we were looking at let me say this, Bella, would you like to say anything here? Just to make sure that you have a chance.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I think that just wasn't something I was following. And earlier I was going to say too, I feel like this was my first real full year up at the session, up in Santa Fe. So I feel like there's still just so much I'm learning. So I don't.
Yeah. It's so fast and furious. I mean,
yeah, it is. I mean, this morning we were looking at, I'll say I was, and shared with you guys the long list of priorities that the governor had around public safety, like right before the session started. And yeah, she got the increased penalty for second-degree murder. She got the 7-day waiting period, but she didn't get like most of her priorities. It was just kind of amazing. She didn't get, I mean, she was even talking about, what was the one? It was panhandling was on her list too. She didn't get that. She didn't get banning assault rifles. She didn't get that, which that didn't surprise me necessarily, but it was a pretty large priority list. And I think when we talk about guns, and I don't want to reduce this to politics because it's a very meaningful issue. It's very substantive, but this is an election year. And so having a very large priority list around guns is, you know, you can think of it as a way of, you know, helping shepherd or keep the flock within the corral, you know, the voters and stuff like that in a presidential election year. And many of our towns and cities, I say many, some of our towns and cities have been struck by gun violence, you know, pretty significant gun violence. I'm thinking of Farmington last year. So, you know, I just wanted to throw that out there, that timing of this is also a part of the whole analysis.
Mhm. So, Nick, Vogus asked for our thoughts about the disappointing demise of the Governmental Conduct Act, which is a bill to reform that, when it died in Senate Judiciary Committee. Nick, that's at the top of our list to discuss today. So maybe we should move on to that and some of the other areas, particularly areas that Bella kind of tracked. So the Governmental Conduct Act, for those of you who didn't follow it, that's the state's main anti-corruption statute. And in the fall of 2022, the New Mexico Supreme Court found that 3 of the 4 provisions in that statute that prosecutors generally thought they could bring criminal charges under, that 3 of those 4 provisions were too vague to bring criminal charges under. So one ethics leader in the state called that gutting the Governmental Conduct Act. So a reform effort, we call it reform, but it's really just kind of redoing that act, was crafted and brought forward last year, actually. So this was the second year it came before the session. And the governor put it on her call. She put this bill on her call. They've rewritten it to make those provisions more clear and more clear that criminal charges, that the legislature means for criminal charges to be brought under these provisions. So they sought to make it more clear, basically. And it's just something that New Mexico in Depth has been tracking. We're very interested in ethics. We've long reported on ethics, and we will continue to follow this story as it progresses. Trip, weigh in here at any time, but I think one thing that we know from years covering like the formation of the State Ethics Commission, transparency laws these things are uphill battles at the State House. They take a really long time to pass. And something that you might look at this statute and you might think, well, this is pretty straightforward. I mean, these are good ideas. It shouldn't be that controversial. Well, we saw that they are. So this bill passed the House easily, sailed through the House. I don't really know what that means about the House. I don't know that that means that all of the House members are on board. Maybe some of them thought, well, it'll get stopped in the Senate. I mean, who knows? We'll let the Senate deal with it, you know?
So,
okay, go ahead, Trip.
The thing that I think about as I ponder this question is that in one of my first years of covering a legislature, one of the veterans told me, you know, legislators they're good at legislating, but they're not great at legislating themselves. And I think that, you know, that's not true of every legislator, but I think that, you know, you can apply that kind of analysis to this situation, which is, you know, this is something that would affect them. And so these questions that are raised, and let me say this, it did pass, I think, unanimously out of the House. Again, we don't know what that means. We've seen that happen so often in the legislative sessions, and then it just dies in the Senate. So the thing that I think is, you know, it also sat in Senate Judiciary Committee for nearly 2 weeks before it had a hearing. on the what was it, next to last day of the session.
It was, let me just say, Trip, it was the day before the session ended in the last 30 minutes of that committee hearing.
Yeah, and
We knew
so
they weren't gonna have time for it when they did.
yeah, and so the thing is that yes, I think that Nick brings up the hypotheticals that Senator Daniel Ivey Soto brought up. And in these hypotheticals, he did not say the name, but he was referencing Phil Griego, a former senator who actually spent time in prison for something he had done. And so whether that was whether those hypotheticals that were raised during the committee, whether they were disingenuous or genuine, I don't know. But I will say that anytime that you have a bill that sits in a committee for 2 weeks during a 30-day session, and it involves, particularly it could affect legislators, you can kind of almost, you can bank on it not having a good chance of survival.
Right.
I think in the 60-day, you will probably have a better chance. I want to say this, and this is about around legislators and stuff like this. This has nothing to do with necessarily the Governmental Conduct Act, but they passed one artificial intelligence bill this session, and it was about commercials, political commercials. Now, who does that affect? Legislators and people running for office. That's another signal right there that, they know this stuff, they care about this stuff. Maybe I'm sounding a little too cynical, but that's my experience of being around these legislatures for close to 25 years.
I just want to also add here, just because, Nick, you asked that question about Ivy Soto. Yes, in that brief hearing, he did get really, in this heated moment, he laid out a hypothetical scenario, which we reported, because it's important, I think, to report. I mean, it's an interesting question that he raised, even if you think it's ridiculous. And it's something I think for people to mull over, but I do not believe that bill sat in that committee. And I will say this, I don't believe that bill sat in that committee for 2 weeks because of one senator.
Right.
It sat in the committee for 2 weeks because there was not enough buy-in from the majority of the senators on that committee, and possibly other senators also on the bill. So there are real reservations around that bill, or they just need to process it a lot more. And we'll likely see it, hopefully. I mean, the thing to do here would be to make sure it's on the interim committee of that Senate committee, the Judiciary Committee, the Interim Judiciary Committee, and that the Courts and Corrections folks,
Courts and Corrections, right.
Take it up. And then my other thing that I might say here is to put it in this bigger context, which you did a little bit, Trip, but this isn't just about the Senate. I mean, another example is like last year, a transparency bill sailed through the Senate that would have made huge improvements on transparency measures. And it included things like fixing our Campaign Finance Act to get around to eliminate the possibility that some of these pop-up, I call them pop-up PACs, every election cycle, these pop-up groups come along, they form a PAC, they spend a lot of money. And there was a lot of effort to make sure that there was disclosure around these requirements, that that just immediately got flouted in the first year that these new laws went into effect. So there was a bill last year that fixed that and also incorporated all these other transparency measures around that would have made it just more where you could see the money being given to lawmakers in a more timely fashion. These things, in my view, are not that controversial, but sailed through the Senate, sailed through House committees, gets to the House floor, and House members vote it down. So, it happens on both sides, and we don't really know why they voted it down. But it definitely that bill had to do with themselves and how they operate as lawmakers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So have we exhausted that topic? We could go on and on.
I don't know if we exhausted it, but I think we should turn to other topics.
Yes.
We could talk about this all year.
Let's briefly talk about alcohol and then get into some of the areas that Bella kind of tracked during the session. Trip, what happened on the solving our alcohol crises front this session?
There was there was movement on the front of increasing or looking at the alcohol excise tax, as there was last year in 2023. This time around, there seemed to be a friction between two factions in the Democratic House caucus, I would say. There were the folks who were looking to increase the alcohol excise tax by, in the end, 12 cents on every drink. And then a new proposal that would actually have changed how alcohol is taxed from wholesalers, which sell to retailers. Now it's on wholesalers, and they would have moved the taxation to retailers. So if you buy point of sale, basically. And so, and it would have lowered the tax on low-income people. They would have paid lower taxes on alcohol. Those people buying higher price alcohol, because this other proposal would have been on the price of the alcohol at the point of sale. Those people paying for higher priced alcohol would pay more. And so there was this basically back and forth, sometimes behind closed doors, sometimes in front of committee hearings, in front of lawmakers, that basically, there was no settlement on which way to go. And both proposals, basically, one that's been around for a couple of sessions, the excise tax increase, died. It was voted on in House Taxation and Revenue and died. The other proposal, which is relatively new, the sponsors, Representatives Cadena and Parajon. Those are the ones I typically, there are 4 or 5 that I really remember. I said, don't vote on this. We'll look at it during the interim. And I think that's what's going to happen now, is there's going to be conversation during this next several months as we go into the 2025 session and see where it heads.
So, yeah, and so less so the Cadena and Parajon proposal, but the one that would increase taxes on the proposal, which has been kind of the main proposal over the last year and a half or so, to raise the tax on volume would raise a considerable amount of money and go into a new alcohol harms alleviation fund. And so these bills are, that bill, I can't really speak to what the aims of the other bill are, other than to make our tax code more progressive. I'm not real clear on it, but the main thrust of this has been twofold. One is to raise a lot more revenue to go into treatment, and the other one is to use tax as a mechanism to decrease consumption. And so it's been kind of like a twofold agenda. And so I just want to note, and it's a little bit kind of moving over to another topic, that on the issue of raising money, while this tax did not pass, so there's not a new alcohol harms alleviation fund, there were significant investments in healthcare this year that should lead to more access to behavioral health services for folks. There was an increase in the Medicaid reimbursement rate to 150% of Medicare. So that's a nice little bump there for doctors who take Medicaid to pay for healthcare in a state where 50% of the people get their healthcare paid for by Medicaid. There was another huge infusion into this new rural healthcare delivery fund that was created last year to the tune of 80 million. I think there's the same or near the same amount this year that is designed to respond to grant proposals to increase services in rural areas where we have a huge healthcare kind of crises brewing out there with lack of services. And the governor said at her press conference at the end of the session that most of the proposals they're getting for that fund would expand behavioral health services. So that kind of expansion helps people who need support for addictions like alcohol addiction. So I mean that's a positive. And then this other really consequential bill passed this session. There were a lot of smaller things that were done to kind of shore up what I think of as rural healthcare. But there was a really consequential bill that kind of flew under the radar a little bit that I think everyone was on board with, that the folks over at the Hospital Association told me would make hospitals in rural areas sustainable, at least in the foreseeable future. It provided for hospitals to pay an assessment. They themselves are going to pay, and they're all on board, according to the Hospital Association, into a fund to create the state match to get supplemental Medicaid payments. And the net benefit of this, they have on paper, they're estimating $1.1 billion more coming in from the federal match, Medicaid match, into hospitals. And they structured it to where rural hospitals would be disproportionately supported. So I mean that's a really huge thing too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think just to add real quickly, I think the 3-to-1 match, that's what it would be with these Medicaid. Usually it's 3-to-1, which is New Mexico puts in $1 and they get $3 back from the federal government as part of Medicaid. I wonder if that's the match here. Is that right? Do you know?
Ask that question again.
So you mentioned the 1.1 billion. I'm assuming that with Medicaid, as in other parts of Medicaid, New Mexico spends $1 and gets $3 back.
Absolutely.
So it would be basically they'd spend 300 million something, and get 1.1 billion.
Yes, these things are really complicated.
Yeah.
It's there's the Medicaid reimbursement rate for people who, these are the base rate. You go in, you're on Medicaid, you see a doctor, there's a Medicaid reimbursement that happens. There's that, they increase that amount. Then there's all these supplemental payments that hospitals can get based on volume of Medicaid patients served and whatnot. It's this other category of Medicaid funding. That's what we're talking about. And the state, however much the state puts in, there's like a 3-to-1 match from the federal government. And so what they have done is create a new fund, and the folks over at the Hospital Association were telling me that 8 other states have done this. So we're like the 9th state to do it, where the hospitals assess themselves. They are going to pay themselves into this, create this new fund that will be the state match that will lead to a huge bump in this federal money flowing into hospitals. And it's not going to cost the state. It's not coming out of the general fund, it's coming out of hospitals' money.
Yeah.
So it's interesting.
I think, Bella has been so patient.
I know. Well, okay. So,
yeah,
let's move to Bella, and we might go over a little bit, but just one final thing. Dee Dee says, if House members are serious about dealing with this issue, and this is the alcohol issue, the alcohol crises where we lead the country in alcohol-related deaths, there should be time for a compromise, but decreasing the tax on beer should not be part of it, as all the data says that beer is the cornerstone of DWI.
Okay.
Wow. Okay. Dee Dee, we're going to have you on because I can't keep up with all your great comments. We'll do one of these with you. So in case everyone doesn't know, we have former Senator Dee Dee Feldman is weighing in here.
She said it was 16 years, not 18 or 20. So she spent 16 years in the state Senate. So she knows how this institution works. So.
All right, so let's move over to Bella. You followed this proposal that we thought had a lot of traction to create a tribal education trust fund. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what happened there?
Yeah, so I guess to start, the idea there was that this trust fund would generate annual interest that tribes could use to build and really control their own education programs. And the bill's sponsors really traced the need for this back to, beginning in the early 1800s, federal boarding schools, an era that lasted 150 years. And even when that policy, it did end about 50 years ago, but federal and state control over education funding has really limited tribes' ability to educate their own children. So that's really where this idea came from. And yeah, we were thinking that it did have a lot of traction this year. One of the sponsors, Representative Lunty, pushed for it last year, but there was some concern about whether there was going to be enough money for each tribe. So he brought it back this year with a bigger ask. He was seeking a $100 million investment. And the House budget actually ended up including 50 million. There wasn't a whole lot of debate in committees. There was, pretty much unanimous support. There were, in a lot of committee hearings, just dozens of tribal leaders, Indigenous students, and educators who spoke in support of it. So its prospects were really looking pretty good this year. But there was quite a bit of debate around how the money would be distributed, which was a pretty significant debate last year too. But the Navajo Nation in particular had concerns about how to distribute the money equitably. And the bill kind of went through a couple different versions. There was an amendment ultimately that would have had, I think the language that was used was a unanimous consensus process, was what ultimately ended up kind of as like the final version of the bill. Originally, the bill would have created a task force, but there were concerns about that. Yeah, Tripp and I ended up talking with the sponsor the night before the last day of the session. So Wednesday, last Wednesday evening, and he told us that he had learned that there were going to be a number of amendments introduced on the Senate floor. At that point, it had made it through the House and all of the Senate committees it needed to. So the last thing was the Senate. And yeah, he ended up pulling it essentially because he heard that there were going to be these amendments, and he had concerns about basically tribes being put in a position to have this argument in a really public way.
Yeah, to add to what Bella is saying, I mean, it passed out of the House after a lot of negotiations, passed out of the House unanimously, as I recall. And later on, I talked to George Munoz, who was Senate Finance. It went to Senate Finance, the Tribal Education Fund. A little quirk of budgeting and policy work. 50 million was in the budget, but the bill that we're talking about had to pass the legislature and get signed by the governor to trigger the spending of the $50 million. So this bill was really important to unlocking that $50 million in the budget. And there was a hope for 100 million. That was what, basically they came out of the House asking for. But, George Munoz told me, he was like, this was the day, I think the afternoon after Senate Finance had passed it out, the Tribal Education Trust Fund. He represents his district in near Gallup, in and around Gallup, includes a lot of Navajos. And he said, it passed out of Senate Finance. I heard it was all, it was all done. We had all agreement. And then he said, then I began hearing that, maybe there wasn't an agreement. And I think that's what we encountered, Bella, when we talked to Representative Lente, I think later in the day, which was all these amendments that were going to attempt to change the legislation. I mean, it's important to say that Representative Lente didn't tell us, where the amendments were coming from, what they said, all that kind of stuff. He just, as Bella said, he didn't want this very public discussion around, I imagine, disbursement of the money to be, held in public.
But we don't know. I just want to be clear here. We don't actually know what the amendments were going to be or who was going to propose them. So we don't really know if this was about a disagreement between tribes or if this was other amendments that were going to be proposed that had to do with the way the fund was structured, how the disbursement was going to be made, and that was coming from the state.
That's an important, significant caveat. Yeah, you're right, Marjorie. We just don't know. I think it was easy for me, I'll only speak for me, to think that maybe disbursement might have been part of the issues, but we don't know. You're exactly right.
I mean, I think I mean, I received, I'm on, at the end of the session, you get a lot of emails from advocacy organizations and whatnot. And I got one from the New Mexico Center for Law and Poverty, which was is long worked closely, I think, with Linty and others on issues related to education, educating
Oh, they were
Indigenous.
part of Yazi Martinez lawsuit.
Yes, the Yazzie
Yeah.
stuff. And that their email basically said that they don't give any details at all, but that the amendments would have shut tribal leaders out of the decision-making process. So,
Oh, okay. Well, that's interesting. Okay.
so
I mean,
I mean, we don't know exactly what those amendments were, and I just don't want to give the impression that we somehow know that it was actually between tribes.
no, that's an important note. It really is. Yeah.
Want to
Yeah.
know if anyone knows, let us know.
Yeah. Let us know. I mean, and
know.
let Bella know. Yeah. I mean, that was it was kind of an interesting. Bella, I think that night, that Wednesday night, when we approached Representative Linte, I don't think either of us expected him to say what he said, which was, I'm going to pull it. And then he said to the question, are you going to run it next year? I'm not sure. I think we both were surprised by that. It was a pretty difficult road, I think.
Yeah, I bet he was dejected a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, it was, yeah, it was. We've got, it's 1:22. We should also ask Bella about if we're done with that, do we want to talk more about that, or we should maybe get into murdered and missing and murdered Indigenous women legislation, and because you also covered that as well, and both in the budget and in a memorial.
Yeah, there were a couple things I was following there. I guess I can start with the memorial. There was a joint memorial that was first introduced in the Senate that calls on the Attorney General to create a new missing and murdered Indigenous people task force. The governor last year dissolved this previous task force that was working on solutions to this crisis. And a lot of, there were some task force members at that time who told us that they felt like their work was really just beginning. The governor's administration has argued that the task force achieved their objectives essentially, and that the state is now carrying forward their recommendations. But there were a couple of senators who were actually involved with that, the former task force, who this year introduced this memorial to kind of try to bring it back. Although the former version of the task force was housed in the Indian Affairs Department, and this memorial calls on the Attorney General to create a new iteration of it, basically. And the sponsors told me there were a couple of reasons for that. One of which is that, the Attorney General works with so many different law enforcement agencies, and with missing and murdered Indigenous people, jurisdiction is a really major challenge, this lack of coordination between jurisdictions. And so, yeah, this memorial actually made it through the Senate and the House unanimously. It passed through the House in the last hour of the session. Yeah, so it is a memorial, so it doesn't have the force of law, unlike a bill. And so now we're just kind of waiting to see what happened. We asked the Attorney General's office, which is now the Department of Justice, but we asked them last week if they were going to create this new task force that the memorial calls for, and they haven't gotten back to us. So that's kind of where that's at. And then the other piece that I was tracking was budget related. The Indian Affairs Department made basically a request for their budget to increase by about $600,000, which would have primarily allowed them to create 4 new staff positions to focus on missing and murdered Indigenous people. At the beginning, or actually in the lead up to the session, the Legislative Finance Committee in their budget proposal recommended that the department get only a fraction of that. And their argument was that the department has a vacancy rate of about 40%. And so LFC argued that they should use their existing personnel budget to hire those new staffers. And so I asked the department about that, and they said that they're actually hoping to fill those existing positions and also create these new positions to focus on missing and murdered Indigenous people. And so they essentially told me that they were not going to try to hire for these new positions because they want to fill those existing vacancies on top of hiring these new positions. So it's a little bit at odds with LFC's recommendation. But the budget that the legislature ended up passing followed LFC's recommendation and didn't give the entire budget increase that the department was seeking. And I asked them last week too, kind of how that changes their plans, if they will kind of end up following LFC's recommendation and use their existing budget to hire those 4 new positions. And they haven't gotten back to me also. So I think
So right now we have the task force that was dissolved. Then now the governor did create an advisory council, but people have said, people who are fans of the task force said it's not the same thing. We need a fully formed task force. That's why you have the memorial. So you don't have a task force. The Indian Affairs Department doesn't have the extra positions for, to focus on missing and murdered Indigenous people, basically. So we're kind of where we were maybe in 2018 or 2019, I guess, or that's just me characterizing it. You don't have to agree with me, but it seems like this has been this was a priority for Michelle Lujan Grisham in 2022, at least when she was at a press conference, and now it seems like maybe there's, I don't know.
Yeah, and I think this is an issue I've really only been covering for about a year, but just from the conversations that I've had, I guess the sense that I have is sort of that when this previous task force was working, which it was disbanded in summer of last year, so about 9-10 months ago. But I think before that, it kind of seemed to me, at least, like there was some cohesion between, lawmakers, the governor's office, advocates about, okay, this is what we're doing. The task force, that previous task force did deliver this like 100+ page response plan in 2022. And so it felt like there was a lot of momentum. And I think that's something that I've heard advocates say too, is that kind of before this decision from the governor last year to get rid of the previous task force, which, isn't the way that the governor's administration characterizes that decision, but it is the way that some task force members have talked about it. That prior to that, we were making a lot of really great progress, and that really other states were kind of looking to New Mexico to try to figure out how to solve this crisis. But I think now at this point, it feels like it is pretty fractured, where you have, a couple of lawmakers who are trying to bring this task force back. The governor's administration says they, did what they needed to do, and has, created this advisory council, which they still haven't, they haven't announced the members of that council yet. So that's kind of a wait and see, but yeah, it feels pretty disjointed at this point.
So one thing maybe you could talk a little bit about what your, the rationale for, because I those are my thoughts. Exactly, is that there doesn't seem to be an organizing force in the state right now around this effort or how to implement the state response plan. But this task force, the memorial to request that the AG create a task force, in some ways you could see that as trying to go around the governor, thinking the governor has made her decision to not convene a task force herself. But weren't there some arguments made that it actually would be better housed in the Department of Justice? That it is more natural, a better fit in that particular agency?
I think that's the argument that I've heard, yeah, from the lawmakers who sponsored it. I think there were 5 or 6 lawmakers on it, but yeah, that is the argument that I heard from them, kind of partly for the jurisdiction reason and maybe having better coordination. But I think it's interesting. I heard from an advocate a couple weeks ago who was pretty surprised to see that memorial. Maybe I don't want to get too into the weeds, but there was a bill in 2022 that created a new position in the Attorney General's office to focus on missing Indigenous people. And that bill also appropriated $1 million for the Attorney General's office to create basically an online portal to track those cases. And under that legislation, the AG's office could have also given grants to tribes to kind of help them in that search effort. And as of November of last year, that those legislative mandates created by that bill hadn't fully been met. The portal hadn't been created, which the AG's office has said that they discovered that the FBI actually has a similar database, and so maybe what the legislation called for in that sense is not essential. And so that they're kind of reevaluating, but so yeah, the portal hadn't been created, and they also hadn't given out any grants as of November, and that was kind of the concern that this advocate raised was, well, they're already, they already have these unmet mandates when it comes to this crisis, so how is this going to work?
Yeah.
So
So this adds even more to this question mark around at the state level, who is going to be in the driver's seat of organizing a response?
exactly.
Meanwhile, I mean, the families and friends of these missing folks are still clamoring for some kind of answer from the state, it sounds like.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there have been families who've been really involved in advocacy. There were a handful of families who protested in Santa Fe last fall over the governor's decision to disband the task force. So this is definitely, something that people are really watching, kind of what the state is going to do next.
Yeah.
We'll be watching. Bella Davis will be watching.
I will be.
That's right. All you state
Yeah.
officials, watch out.
We're going to continue reporting in this area for sure. And so thanks for that rundown, Bella. It's 1:32, so we should start wrapping up. And I just think we should note that we're heading into an election. The entire House and Senate, they're all up for re-election, and there were a lot of retirements. And so I think next year during the session, we're going to see a new group of people. I mean, not entirely, obviously, but we're going to see a lot of new faces next year.
Eight senators are
Mhm.
retiring from the Senate. That's almost 20%.
Right.
And a couple of I know a couple of lawmakers in the House are not running for their seats to run for those Senate seats. At least that's the, so it's going to be, you normally have some turnover each election. This is going to be a really interesting election as far as how it affects the legislature.
And then for us, I think it's going to be interesting, and I hope everyone else here as well. It's going to be interesting to see how artificial intelligence gets brought into campaigning, which that disclosure bill that passed was good.
Hasn't been signed yet, but yes.
Right. And we send anything our way that you run across on that front. So maybe we'll do another conversation in a month or so, previewing the election season. Once we kind of get a better handle on all the seats and who all's running and whatnot. So
There is so much to talk about this year.
Bella, do you have any other closing thoughts or?
I don't think so.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Bella.
Happy to be here.
Thanks for all your good work during the session. You were up there
Yes.
quite a bit, tracking these particular issues. So
Yeah, it was exciting. It was fun.
do we have any? I think we might do we have a few more? I think we're good. Questions? Did we miss
I
any?
think there was one that Nat Dean asked Bella, any thoughts on the change of leadership for Indian Affairs? That was pretty quick, right? I mean, that's a quick one. You can, how the new maybe Indian Affairs Secretary was treated by the legislature.
Yeah, I think I think with that question, I definitely think about missing and murdered Indigenous people. That's kind of the main communication I've had with the department. But I think I have talked with some advocates who are hopeful with this change of leadership. I think that was something that came up a lot last year, was that they kind of felt shut out. And I think with the new secretary coming in, I think there is a sense of, so maybe some hope that will change. So that'll be interesting to see, I think.
In the Senate Rules Committee didn't really have much debate over the new secretary. She was confirmed, and which is in a great contrast to her predecessor, who never got a vote in front of the Senate Rules Committee. So, yeah, it's interesting times.
Thanks everyone for joining us and for all the questions and comments. We really appreciate it. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Yes. Bye.